Welcome to the Bassanda Podcast. I'm Chris Smith. This is a space for riffing upon history and upon speculative fiction, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Bassanda the Mythical Nation originates in the fertile musical and ancillary imaginations of my friends Roger Landis and Chipper Thompson, and you can find their links in the show notes. When, as a friend of the General and the Reverend, I was first playing with the idea of a fictional alternate universe identity for my own Texas Tech University Celtic ensemble, I realized that perhaps I didn't have to invent a world if the lads were willing to let me borrow Bassanda. They were, and here we are. The first novel set in this universe, which is serialized at smithscribe.substack.com, is The Great Train Ride for Bassanda, an epic adventure across Europe by train and smuggler's ship in order to return ancient documents of power to the independent nation of Bassanda so that they can resist Tsarist invasion. For The Great Train Ride, the principal POV character in 1906 is Cecile Lapin, a young ethnographer and translator. We'll also meet the Bassandan assassin Ismail Durang, who begins as her protector on her epic journey and eventually becomes her lover. A little later on, we're going to meet Jefferson Lincoln Habjar-Lawrence, who is her professor of ethnography at the Sorbonne and also a scion of New England clipper ship money. He comes from a long line of Eastern scholars and proto-Buddhists amongst the New England transcendentalists. There's a little bit of Emerson and a little bit of Henry David Thoreau in Habjar-Lawrence, and also a little bit of William James. And we establish through his own biographical backstory his family's circuitous route toward a Bassandan connection. We also realize that although he is a father, he's a widower, and that there are some sorrows in his past. A little later, after the street fight in a Montparnasse alley, we meet Algeria Main-Smith, another of these late 19th century transcendentalists, but another who's not quite so crazy as the contemporaneous theosophists. There are interesting stories of privileged but nevertheless simpatico Anglo scholars and advocates for colonial cultures in the Edwardian period, and some of them were women who were finding ways to pierce the glass ceiling of scholarship via their interest in colonial cultures and indigenous peoples. She's featured in an early episode of The Correspondence in which Algeria Main-Smith, while making a grand tour of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, hears word of and eventually meets the Brethren. We subsequently find out that she's gay, and that provides another very important contrasting POV to that of Jefferson Lincoln and of Cecile Lapin. In this craft-oriented episode, I want to talk about the ways in which I arrived at the realization that for this fourth installment of the podcast and these fourth and fifth chapters of The Great Train Ride, I needed to establish another POV, ideally one separated in time and experience from those already set up for 1906. At the same time, I also wanted to introduce some of the SFF and magic elements which were going to recur as small but significant elements within the story of the train ride and of the journey of the ancient documents of peace from Paris to Bassanda to resist the Tsarist invasion. My vehicle for that was the young scholar and Vietnam combat veteran S. Jefferson Winesap, who in the late 1960s and early 70s began to consider the idea of going back to school after several combat tours in Vietnam. He was interested in ethnography again, and he wound up studying with the Bassandan scholar Homer St. John at Miskatonic University. In this particular episode, the opening line tells us what the topic will be, and indeed the vehicle for this craft-oriented introduction of magic. Jefferson Winesap begins, "It started out with that photograph." It's an actual photograph which appears in the manuscript. It depicts a group of musicians wearing concert black with an odd conglomeration of instruments, including orchestral instruments, but also piano accordions and various types of indigenous instruments, standing in a bleak Soviet-era rehearsal hall. They look stiff and posed as if they're not entirely pleased to be photographed, and they are all wearing fezzes along with their concert blacks. It's a bit difficult to understand exactly what's being depicted here, but it's labeled BNRO the classic 1952 band. On one hot Saturday evening in June, S. Jefferson Winesap is working through the professor's archives at the professor's request because he's been set on a bit of a snipe hunt to find an article whose exact provenance the scholar St. John can't himself recall. It's a hot Saturday afternoon, he's having very little luck, and his eye is taken by this photograph, about which he says, quote, "I knew that it depicted the Stalin-era version of the Bassanda National Radio Orchestra, the state folkloric ensemble, founded by the professor's old comrade Yezgit Nasselson in the waning days of World War II. Now, there's some real-life storytelling happening here as well, mixed in with the spec fiction and the alternate history, because there were Soviet-era national folkloric ensembles who drew a good salary and benefits to tour and espouse the idea of a socialist paradise in which many different ethnicities could find their arts and indigenous culture represented and celebrated on the stages of the world, particularly behind the Iron Curtain. And paradoxically, with the fall of the wall much later in the late 1980s, the bottom dropped out for those ensembles. Many of them found that their salaries and benefits disappeared. Many of them were disbanded. And the few who continued tended to maintain their presence in the West through the sheer luck of the draw of having established a touring presence beyond the Iron Curtain. And we might think here particularly of the Bulgarian Women's Choir, whose album Le Mystère Voix de Bulgarie, The Mysterious Voices of Bulgaria, became actually a worldwide world music hit. So there is a bit of a historical backstory for ensembles like the BNRO. But what happens to S. Jefferson Winesap that hot Saturday evening on the campus of Miskatonic in his professor's musty library and study is that he recognizes that the photograph may possibly have certain psychoactive qualities. He stares at the photograph, and he can almost see the eyes move underneath those photographed shadowed eyes in the low-grain sepia photograph. He can almost see them moving. He can imagine the scene in this musty-smelling, dank and drab Soviet-era brutalist office building, and he can smell the color and hear the sounds that this band brought with them. And then he's looking further, and he realizes that he's looking into the eyes of the woman he knows to be Cecile Lapin. And across that 35-year distance, it felt as if she were literally making eye contact. And then suddenly, he's interrupted by the call of a raven, because Miskatonic University, of course, just like the Tower of London, has ravens in residence. The raven sits on the windowsill and stares at him and caws again, and then with one flip of its wings disappears. Winesap says, "I looked down at the photograph, which was again simply a dusty sepia image of some long-lost and somber faces. I became conscious of the heat and stuffy atmosphere in the professor's dim office. And then..." And to find out more, you'll have to read more. But I will tell you that in the next episode of the podcast and the next installment of the Great Train Ride for Bassanda, we'll hear exactly why Cecile Lapin is a target of Tsarist assassins, and why she finds it intrinsic upon herself that she has to take up the cause of Bassanda and join the Brethren and Ismail Durang and her professor Jefferson Lincoln Habjar-Lawrence on an epic train ride across Edwardian Europe. This is the Bassanda Podcast, a place for riffing upon history, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Each week we recall chapters in the correspondence, and we talk with guests from this multiverse and beyond about world building and imagination. You can find us on your podcast app, and also Twitter and Threads and Blue Sky. Search hashtag Bassanda Podcast, send to bassandapodcast@gmail.com, or find me at Chris Smith Muso. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll talk to you again soon.